from Germany today. And thank you so much, Bernd Rücker, for being here with us. And Bernd is the co-founder and chief technologist at Camunda. Bernd is a software developer at heart who has been innovating process automation and deploying it in highly scalable and agile environments of industry leaders such as T-Mobile, Lufthansa, ING, and Atlassian. He contributed to various open source workflow engines for more than 15 years. Bernd is the co-founder and chief technologist of Camunda, an open source software company that is reinventing process automation. His work focuses on new process automation paradigms that fit into more modern architectures around distributed systems, microservices, domain-driven design, event-driven architecture, and reactive systems. Bernd, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. We're very excited about your presentation.
Thanks very much for the introduction. Can everybody see my screen? I think that worked. Yes, awesome. Great, yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for joining today's talk. I want to talk about practical process automation. It's kind of a wide field, and I think Jose already did give you some context, and I think it's not a big surprise nowadays. I mean, we live in the age of digitalization. I love this article, why all companies fear death by Amazon, and that can have different angles. So one could be like, probably Amazon puts you out of business directly, or they're competing with you, or some fintech or insurtech or whatever is competing with your business. But also on the other side, these companies are setting the bar for customer expectations, and these expectations are rising because of what companies like Amazon can deliver. And that's basically affects everybody of us. I love this this survey a customer told us about. It was an insurance company in Germany in this case, and they did a customer satisfaction survey. They do that every year, and then they basically look at the numbers and how they develop. And they looked at that, and it was 2018, so even quite a while back. So it might have dramatically decreased since then. I don't know. But they looked at all of these numbers and saw, okay, the satisfaction with the speed of claim settlements dropped and dramatically in a way. So they looked at okay, what's the speed of processing of claim settlements? It was nearly constant. So they're not getting any slower, but the customer expectations have risen. And that means the satisfaction is much worse with the same speed of claim settlements. And that's a problem they have to deal with. I was sitting together, it was pre-COVID, with a CIO of a German insurance company during lunch, and he basically told me, okay, and that was very humble. I like that actually. But he also said, we don't know what we will need tomorrow. I don't have a magic crystal ball. I can't foresee the future. But what I know is that there will be changes, and there will be big changes coming up. And whenever we see them coming, whenever we really anticipate what's happening, then we have to be in a position to be able to move quickly, right? And this is my job, to bring us there, to bring us into that position to move quickly. And that's about agility. And that's, I think, what's all about nowadays. And we had that agile movement, like agile development, for example, software development, like 10 years, 15 years back, that was a huge thing. So we understood a lot of these practices by now as an industry, but now it's really about business agility, like probably introducing complete new business models, changing the way we're working dramatically from today to tomorrow. And that's about business agility, and that's super important. I also threw up the a Forrester report, for example, they published in November 2020, so it's pretty recent. And they were saying also because of the pandemic, now the metric for success isn't cost efficiency or even business agility, it's velocity. And that I find that interesting. The speed of business transformation is the most critical metric for every company. Okay, I put that a little bit out of context, but I find that super important. So business agility and the speed of doing things, the velocity of changes. If you look at velocity, I totally love the following book. It's called Accelerate. You probably know that. It's not super hidden, but I always find it surprising how many people have never heard of that book. I love it. I can totally recommend it. It's what they did, these folks writing Accelerate, they basically survey or they study a lot of different companies around the planet, around different industries, really a huge sample size of companies, how they do software development, right? What's the practices, certain things they do and they don't do, and they also look at the success of the company overall. And then they publish their learnings from that, but in a very scientific way. It's not like, hey, we asked 20 random CIOs what they think. It's really, really very scientific. That's what I like about that. So you can use that to really draw conclusions with a very good foundation. And if you're not into reading the book, I can also understand that time is limited. I can recommend to read the report. So from the methodology, what they describe in the book, they draw new numbers every year, and then they publish that as the so-called State of DevOps report. So there was one in 2018, and you see they're normally sponsored, which also means they're available for free as a PDF. So you can just Google for it, get it. And they are published like with the latest numbers normally every year. So there's even a State of DevOps report 2020, for example, if you want the latest one. If you look in these reports, I just drew a couple of insights. One thing I found very interesting, because that's why it matters, is that they found that high-performing organizations were consistently twice as likely to exceed these goals, which are profitability, market share, and productivity, as low performers. So in my words, it really matters. It makes a huge difference if I can be twice as successful, right? But what is the difference between high-performing and low-performing organizations? So when you look at that, they basically look at the software development practices they have in-house, and they're basically saying, okay, the elite performers have 46 times more frequent code deployments. And I'm coming back to that, what that means in a second. It basically means the elite performance pushing every commit to production immediately, continuous delivery. They're 2,555 times faster from commit to deploy. So it's really fast. They have lower failure rates because of that, normally because they have more smaller commits, and they're pushing them to production very, very quickly, which leads to less failures. And if they have a failure, they can recover fast because everybody knows what they just deployed, okay? So there are a lot of these things are interconnected. So they are impressive numbers. That's what I'm trying to get at. And just to give you an idea, I don't want to walk you through the details, but to give you an idea what that means, deployment frequency for elite performers are on demand. So really commit, deploy multiple times per day. Lead time for change is less than 1 hour, right? And I know organizations that take months to deploy a change. And that's normally here between 1 month and 6 months. And that's not totally uncommon. Then you're on the low performer end, right? And so on and so forth. You can read that yourself. I just trying to get at that this is really important. And what they also find, and I like this because I was discussing that very, very regularly with bigger organizations, because Gartner coined the term of that bimodal IT, where they basically said, okay, you must have different speeds, different velocities in your company, because you have these like big ERP-like systems, which keeps all the records, and they must be stable, so you move slowly. And then you have these like small iterative things for new innovative products or business models or processes around that, right? And that can evolve quickly. And what that book found is that this is nonsense. If you go for a process, for a development process that gives you the speed and the continuous delivery, you get both, right? You get the speed, but also stability, because all the numbers before, right? So this is kind of the way you should aim for as an organization if you look at software development. I'm looking at what that has to do with process automation in a second, okay? And industry doesn't matter. I also found that interesting because I hear that sometimes. We are in this industry, we don't do this. We're too whatever for continuous delivery. No, you're not. Shortcut. So, and for me, process automation is one of the core enablers of digitalization, business agility, and velocity. And I think today I don't have to talk about the benefits of process automation, right? So what we just talked about, business agility, time to value, efficiency, customer experience is improving, you can scale everything, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of these benefits. I don't have to talk about them today here, I think. But what I want to talk about is how do I get that into my company, into my undertaking? Because the reality is actually sometimes pretty frightening. So on the one side, you have all these organizational challenges, like whatever your organization is look like, it's kind of there. You can't ignore that for process automation projects. You have legacy. You have a lot of IT systems. Most companies I know have really old legacy systems that needs to work in order for their business to continue. And they can't replace that like immediately, big bang, but they have to gracefully move away from that. You have at the same time an increasing number of IT components or applications. I mean, almost daily new stuff is popping up that you need to adapt to. Right? And at the same time, and this, I come back to that later on, because this is very interesting. At the same time, you have a limitation of resources, developers, for example. So we would need much more developers in order to get process automation right. But they're just not on the market at the moment. They're not enough people knowing that, which we could bring into the job. Okay, so this is kind of the reality. So the question is like, how can we succeed with process automation in this environment? And I thought about that for quite a bit. And I did something, or I developed something I call the process automation web. And I want to walk you through this a little bit, because that, with the customers, I discussed that gives them a bit of orientation, how to maneuver in this environment. And one of the big decisions you normally always make in the very beginning is, do you buy something or do you build something yourself? So I talked about software development in the beginning. Do I really have to do software development, or can I just buy a standard software which does everything for me? And that's a very valid question. And I mean, one of the important things here, it's not a surprise and it's not very innovative, but it's important, is can you differentiate by using standard software? We have a lot of telecommunication companies as customers, besides insurance, banking, and stuff. We also have a lot of telecommunication companies, and they all use these operating software for the networks. And most of them use kind of the same software. And that's why I love this story. And it's from AT&T quite a while back in the 1970s. They had kind of the monopoly on long distance call in the US. Long distance calls at that point in time were really, really expensive. So you thought twice before doing a long distance call, right? It's not like today, it was really expensive. And AT&T had a competitor called MCI. And what they did, they thought of a new business model of saying, hey, we can have a circle of friends and family. You can define that, and you can make calls to that circle, only these persons, for for the price of local calls, basically. That was kind of the idea. Now AT&T, and that was the interesting part of that story, AT&T tried to stop that legally, didn't work. And then they couldn't compete with that. Why? Because their software, their operating software, couldn't handle that business model. There's a bit of more documentation in the web available as well. And that meant because they have this kind of standard software in place, they probably can't support that process which would be needed in order to beat competition here. That was a huge lose for them. On the other end, that's kind of my personal thing at the moment, because or family is involved in a lot of these eco-friendly shops or economic shops. And if you look at a lot of these shops which are evolving today, what they do is they sell very specific items, right? It has very, whatever, you probably know that better than me, but there are a lot of specific characters of these articles, but the shop itself, it's totally standard. You have a shop off the shelf, the order fulfillment processes are standard, so you're not innovating via the process, but you're innovating via the product you're offering. And that's fine. I mean, it just means you have to know what you're having in front of you in order to decide. And these are, for me, the first axis of these process automation map. So one could be, do I want to, or do I need a standard process like the order fulfillment in these shops? Or does it have to be very unique? I have a couple of other examples later on, something like, hey, I have this whatever customer onboarding process, and I need to talk to these 20 legacy systems, which are very unique for my situation. That's a very different thing. And at the same time, you have to decide if you want to innovate via the process. So can you live with a standard process because it's fine, you don't innovate via the process? Or should the process be the part where you really need innovation in order to get it in front of competition, for example? One example are insurances using like telematics, for example. That was, I mean, starts to get more normal, but it's still pretty innovative, and it changes a lot of the business processes they're operating. And now the interesting part is, if you have this kind of map, you can basically rate your processes, and then you have sweet spots. So for example, if you're in that corner and saying, hey, I have a standard process and I don't want to innovate, you buy software. If you're more on the right-hand upper corner here, where you say, I need a very unique process and I want to innovate with the process, then you need something very tailor-made. And then you're in the realm of building things, okay? And that's important to keep in mind. There's no one size fits all. There's not, hey, buying is always better than building, or the other way around. You have to understand what you have in front of you to basically decide for the solution. As you can see, there are a couple of more axes, and they are pretty interesting. So I want to walk you through them. I think this was kind of the warming up. That was kind of the easy part. One thing, and I find that particularly interesting at the moment, is the scope. What do you want to automate? Do you want to automate one task, or do you want to automate a real process? And I give you an example where I want to walk you through that. And that's kind of the classical, because there's a lot of misunderstanding in that axis at the moment in the market. So let me walk you through one example. It's again telecommunication. I'm sorry for being a bit telco here today. But this is a technician of the German telecom company, Deutsche Telekom. And if they do something hardwiring with the lines, what they have to do afterwards is they have to check if the line is working. Right? And it was, when did they start that product? 2016, 2017, so a couple of years back, actually. The way of doing that was they had to call an inbound colleague saying, okay, this is the number I want to check. Oh, so, da, da, da. And then the inbound colleague entered that in a legacy system. The legacy system did the line check, presented the result, and you're done. In order to do that, the technician had to wait in line for 3 to 5 minutes before somebody was available, like on average. And that's pretty long, right? So overall, this task was relatively slow. It took a long time. And if you extrapolate that for all the technicians all over Germany, that's quite a lot of time wasted. So it was also very expensive. Not only this guy has to wait, these persons also need to be there. It was pretty annoying for everybody, right? So it was far from being a good process, a good task. What they did, and that's what you also know about robotic process automation. I mean, Jose also mentioned RPA in the beginning. It's kind of a hype topic at the moment, and I think you're most probably familiar with that. If not, this is my one slide explanation for RPA. It's kind of the Microsoft Excel or Microsoft Office macro recorder. That's what a lot of people know, right? You click on record and then you can click around and the recorder records that and can replay that later on to automate simple things. It's on steroids, so it's a bit more powerful than that because you can steer any application you like via its front end. And then you get these kind of flows which then can automate this interaction with the user interface. That's kind of the idea of RPA. Very often the history of RPA tools is around automating tests based on user interface. Okay, this is RPA. And they use that in order to automate the entering on the legacy system, and then the technician has a portal, an app basically on his smartphone doing something, getting back the result immediately. So that was a big win for everybody. That was a great project, very successful for Deutsche Telekom. So that's a good application of RPA. But, and that's interesting, and I linked the talk on one of the next slides, because they did a full talk at the CommonderCon about the whole project and their journey, because now that was a successful project, but then a couple of problems started. And why is that? The first, and I don't want to go into details about that today, was a kind of a governance problem, because this was driven by basically the business. Other business departments started doing stuff as well. It was not well coordinated. It was not clear who operated the stuff. They ended up with, I think, 7 different RPA platforms, and they had a lot of issues with that. So it was not easy to govern. That was the one problem. But the second problem, and that's what I want to talk about today, is they were mixing task and process automation. They're mixing things up. And I want to explain that with an example. I blogged about that quite a while back. There's a link. A typical RPA flow looks a little bit like this. Hey, open this application, go into that field, enter something there, press that button, and so on and so forth. And at some point in time, it might say, okay, now open another application to enter the same data there, for example. So what it basically does, it mixes a lot of the UI interaction for one task, like entering data into the CRM system, with all the UI interaction for another task, which might be create the order in the ERP system, right? And if this is all mixed up, you can't see the forest for the trees anymore. So you should separate that. You should look at the process automation layer, what's like the sequence of activities, of tasks, and how to automate a single task. And that's a very different thing, right? And it has different requirements. And that's important to separate. Just keeping in the example of, or staying in the example of Deutsche Telekom, they kind of did that, exactly that journey. So they started very manual, right? That was the technician calling. And then they basically automated part of that by RPA, but they ended up in what they call spaghetti bot automation. And then they started to extract the process layer and say, okay, we need orchestration above these RPA bots in order to separate the both concepts. And what they're currently at is a lot of replacing bots with real API calls, because APIs are much less brittle than bots, right? So it gets a much more stable solution at the very end. If you want to look into that, that's what I meant. I linked to the blog post, and there's the recording link, so you can look into everything they talked about yourself. So I find this a very important difference. So do you look at task automation or process automation? And if you look at low-code tools, for example, you have the same thing. If you look at things like Zapier, they typically automate one task, one thing, but not the process, right? Nice. The next axis I have in here is the process complexity. So you might have very simple processes where you just integrate, let's say, one system with another, right? This sometimes might even simply be task automation, right? It can be very simple, but it can be very complex, where you involve a lot of different legacy applications with a lot of different APIs, probably involving different teams, different development teams to take part, or different users to be notified via task list or whatever. So that can be a big variety of complexity. I added scale as a separate axis. It's sometimes interwoven with complexity, but it might be that I just have one team solving a very local pain for them, right? Or it can be a big scale, which means, again, I involve a lot of applications people, or I have a large volume of instances, like I'm doing order fulfillment and I have millions of orders a day, right? That could be also scale. And the last one is the product setup. Also, this can be a wide variety. So you could have an ad hoc product. Oh, we have this pain, we need to solve it now, right? Now, we don't care how good we solve it, we just need to solve it now. Or we have something which is temporary. We need to do that data, we need to fix that data like now, one time, then we throw everything away. That's a very different thing than setting up a product and saying, okay, I'm developing a process solution for the next 5 to 10 years, right? Or we have customers running a complete department for a certain process automation project. So that's a big variety of things. And now what you can do, and that's the exercise you should actually, if you want to automate a process, you can rate that on this map. So with the technician example earlier on, the telecom technician, it's relatively unique. It doesn't have to be very innovative. I mean, unless you count using the smartphone as innovative, which might be true for some companies. It's not too complex. It's not a huge scale. It's task automation more than it's process automation. So RPA might be fine. And it's somewhere in the middle here. And by the way, this is my gut feeling. This is nothing I designed together with Telecom. That's the disclaimer I want to make here. But then I can easily show it here. So that's my gut feeling. I have other examples. And if I looked through official case studies from us, from Camunda, that's pretty cool because I can quote them here. But I start doing this exercise with a lot of different customers. And it's very interesting actually to have this discussion. So in this case, Helsana, that's a Swiss insurance company, they wanted to sell insurance directly online within 2 days, which is kind of an innovative process, like people coming to the web portal, identify themselves and do everything online. This is not how they traditionally work. It needed paper to send around and so on and so forth. So it's relatively unique because they have to integrate a lot of their own legacy systems. So it's nothing they can just buy as software and it will automatically work. It's relatively innovative. That's what I mean. It's not the standard that people do that themselves online. It's not too complicated. It's not a huge scale, but it's definitely a process and it's planned setup. And to get a bit more on the other end of the scale, one other customer from ours in Germany, it's Zalando. They're pretty active in Europe. They are kind of the Amazon for clothes in Europe. And they do order fulfillment with Camunda. So they have these 145 million annual online orders processed. They have, for example, runtime requirements because they need to be very, very quick in responses to the customer, like below 300 milliseconds, for example. And there they use also Camunda. So if you look at that order fulfillment process, for example, it's pretty much on this edge of the spectrum. So it's very unique for a lot of reasons what they do in the order fulfillment. You can't simply buy that in a shop software. It's not super innovative, but they do a couple of things which are really innovative for order fulfillment. It's not super complex, but relatively complex, but it's on a big scale. It's definitely a process and they have their own department running it, right? So that's where this is located in a way. And now you can do the same exercise for every process you automate. And that's an important thing. It's not a company-wide decision. Hey, we want to be on that side of the map. No, you have to look at that one process you want to automate. And then you have to understand where it fits. And of course, there is some fuzziness involved. But you normally can spot the area where you're looking at. And then you typically have sweet spots, right? And the animation seems to be broken. Let's remove it. So we already talked about commercial off-the-shelf software you simply buy, or you build something. If you build something, this is how you can read it. Then you can decide between low code, that's pretty hype at the moment, or what we call pro code. Or I prefer the term developer-friendly tool, like on this or that side. And that's an important decision you have to make, and it has to fit the process you're looking at. That's important. And the difference is really that on the one side of that spectrum, you give developers tools that they can easily automate processes, and I come back to that in a second. Or on the other end of the spectrum, you give business people the low-code tooling in order to do something themselves. And both might work, but it's a very different strategy. And it really depends on where you're looking at. So if you have these kind of processes, low-code might be a really good choice. If you're on that side of the spectrum, it might not work at all. And I'm coming back to something in a second. I wanted to give you one slide, which I find interesting in that context. And Jose already did the introduction. I normally do it at that point when I already delivered some content, but just that you know my personal opinionation about the topic. I'm super enthusiastic about developer-friendly tools. I'm a developer in my heart, so I have a degree in what was it called, software technology. And I worked on different open source projects, different workflow engines, open source workflow engines over the last 15 years. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I co-founded Camunda. We're source available. We're delivering that developer-friendly tooling, and we're pretty successful with it. That's the short summary of that slide. And I mean, you can have a look at that yourself. As you can see, we're targeting a lot of different use cases for different industries. That's what I also said in the beginning. It's not industry specific, but you can also, in a way, see where on that spectrum I just had on the map we're normally working. So we're more on the right part of it, with onboarding, loan origination, or whatever, risk management, fraud detection. We have payment stuff, so you can read that yourself. And if I only use one slide for explaining what developer-friendly is, I normally use this one. So you probably design a process model, which you then give to a workflow engine, which can execute instances of that. Hey, somebody booked a ticket, let's go through this, reserve seats, and so on and so forth. And in order to make that work, what you do, for example, in our platform, is then you provide additional code, source code, programming in the language you like. In this case, it's Java, Spring Boot, and Camunda Cloud, but it could also be whatever, Node.js, Python, C#, whatever. For example, to provide a REST endpoint, which then kicks off that process instance, right? Or you provide a bit of glue code, how generating tickets work. In here, you call a REST endpoint. And the cool thing is you're using exactly the tooling the developers are always using. So you can leverage that experience. You can use the normal way of testing these solutions. You can use the normal way of CI/CDing, like continuous delivery. And that's kind of the link back to the Accelerate book. So you can use all these practices for getting velocity, for getting this very successful IT practices, also for process automation with this kind of approach. And I totally believe in that. I'm a huge fan, and we're seeing that it works with a lot of customers, actually. That's developer-friendly too. Yeah, and that's why we're saying we can automate any process anywhere. To some extent, I love explaining that a little bit, at least. I mean, with this approach, I can do everything. I can even integrate your very weird legacy system, because if you can go into programming code, you can do everything. You're not limited by what we have foreseen. That's why we can make the bold statement. But still, you need to look at where you want to be in that spectrum. So normally, most of our customers are somewhere here, because there it really makes a difference to use these kind of developer-friendly tools. It makes, or it's important to have the velocity. It's probably not so important if you're on that end, or low code might work on that end. I mean, you can still do stuff with Camunda, but that's kind of the idea. And then if you think back of velocity and the Accelerate book, one thing I think you have to keep in mind is that if you apply the wrong kind of tooling for the wrong kind of process, you're really screwed. So just with the Accelerate book in mind, and that's what I see a lot of companies are currently trying, if they apply low code for these problems on the right end of the spectrum, most often because there are not enough developers for them. this can't be successful. I mean, first of all, you don't reach these practices like in the Accelerate book. And the second is it's kind of a downward spiral, because it normally means your developers, the developers you have, they're frustrated by these tools. And this will normally make the good developers leave, and you're not able to attract good developers anymore. And that's kind of a really bad thing. So if you're on that side, you really have to invest in developers. And you have to mean that. They smell it if it's like, yeah. No, you can code, but we do low code. And that's kind of a strategy. And I find that important to keep in mind. Cool. So 2 things to be aware of in this context, and I saw both. So the first is RPA is not kind of a magic wand where it can like automate any process. For me, RPA is robotic task automation. In a way, it can automate one task if a system doesn't have an API. It's very important for process automation, but it's not a silver bullet. Be aware of that. Like, if you know these risks, that's what better. At the same time, just because there are these pro code tools doesn't mean you have to apply it for everything and get very technologically. So you have to find your place in the map and apply the right toolings. And last comment on that, and then of course, these categories are not as easy as I described them. They also overlap. So for example, like if you look at Camunda, we're here in the digital process automation space. We're also having capabilities to understand processes that are not automated on our engine. We also have capabilities to orchestrate robots. RPA tools are buying into software to basically trying to get into the DPA space and so on and so forth. And the same for mining tools. They're getting into the execution. For example, we're getting into the understanding part. So there's some overlap. So it stays complicated. If you want to get started, I wrote that lovely book. If you're interested in the developer-friendly approach, then this might be a good start. It goes into that approach with a more technical lens onto that. There are also examples if you want to run something. It also talks about orchestrating RPA if you're interested in that, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much. Jose, do we have questions?
Well, listen, nobody's sleeping like that right now, Bernd. I can guarantee you, everybody's commenting, is making the connection here. This is fantastic. Thank you so much. You did such a great job of setting the stage for that, you know, one size does not fit all when it comes to the solutions, and I think you did a really good job at showing the different dimensions of on the decision making for buy versus develop, and then the rationale behind each one of those segments. Very useful. We got lots of comments about that, so we want to thank you for guiding everybody through that. There was I can tell you that based on the questions that I've been seeing here, there's going to be we're going to need a follow-up session that we're going to focus specifically on low-code tools for business people. That got a lot of attention because there is a bit of a promise of low-code or no-code tools for business people, but the reality quite often is not there either. I think that developers sometimes are overestimating the ability that business people have of using low-code or no-code tools. So can you talk a little bit about that? What is the stage of development for low-code tools for business people versus the developers?
It's interesting that you say it like this, because I would have phrased it the other way around. I think developers, as far as I see, are not really believing in low code for business. They're not, at least for these, that's what I'm trying to get at, for these more complex processes. So the story I see, and that's happening at a lot of customers, is typically always the same. It's like, okay, we buy this low code or no code tooling because we have normally limited resources in IT or whatever. The business doesn't talk to the IT, or there are a lot of these reasons which are around. We don't get access to the right IT resources, so we buy low code so we can do it ourselves. For a simple process that might work, then you still end up with the governance problems we also saw with Deutsche Telekom, but that might be something you can handle for simple processes. But if you look at more complex scenarios, it simply doesn't work. You have to integrate a system which is not easily integratable. You have to, I mean, you probably just have to call some API which is not supported. You have to do this and that, where normally a business person simply can't do it, which makes sense. I mean, that's why they're looking into the business, they're not developers. And that means normally these tools are then handed over to IT, or some developers are like fetched into the project, like, hey, can you solve that for us? Can you do that? And then developers are normally, for them, this kind of tool is alien. You can't use any of the practices they know. They can't do normal programming. They have to do some whatever weird script language. They can't do testing. They can't do deployment in the way they know. They probably can't do the security in the way they normally do it. So there are a lot of problems they have. So they normally kind of hate these tools. It's not always the case, but normally that's kind of the case. And then you're in a situation where you're really stuck. Like the business can't do it, the IT hates it, and that's not a recipe for success. So scenarios where low code can work is, I think, if you have the right process for it. If you have something which is very simple, which is just local to a department, for example, all these, I mean, what we did with Microsoft Access 10 or 20 years back, a lot of like local solutions, that solves the problem. I mean, also within Camunda, we have solutions with Airtable and Zapier and these kind of things. Works, yes, for certain things, but not for these more complex or end-to-end processes. And that's why I find it so important to understand what you're looking at and then like getting at the right solution.
And you did a fantastic job driving that point about where the right application sits, and that was very, very helpful. And your answer just emphasizes the importance of knowing where you are in that spectrum. That's very helpful. Just out of curiosity, does Camunda develop low code, no code type of tools as well, or you work more just on the developer side?
So for us, it's developer friendly. It's pro code. That's what I meant. There's some fuzziness in the middle. So for example, what we do, and I think marketing drives that crazy. We called it smart low code. It basically says we're pro code, we're for the developer, but we're trying to make it easy for the developer sometimes. So we have convenience features making it easier, or we have customers doing just RPA orchestration, for example. And there we have certain elements where this person could click together things without real development. So that moves a bit into the low code direction, but it's always still open. So if you hit a limitation, you can always have a hook and you can do development if you like. So for us, it's making things a little bit easier, but we're definitely still on the pro code side.
That's fantastic. We are running out of time here, so I want to make sure that people know where to go. Where is the best place? You've mentioned a few different references. Where's the best place for a lot of the people who are asking questions about this pro code applications? Where is the best place for them to go learn more, to connect with experts who can guide further than what we discussed today?
I mean, what I can always recommend as kind of, if I select one go-to place, it would be the Camunda forum. It's very technical to some extent, but you can ask everything, and we have people looking at it, so they can still distribute it. That's definitely one place where you can go. So go to the Camunda webpage, and you will find your way there. Of course, you can always also reach out to me on whatever, LinkedIn, Twitter. I'm sure you will find me in the internet.
Wonderful, Bernd. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights, a masterclass on the topic. On behalf of our global community, we're grateful to have you here sharing that expertise with us.
Thank you, Jose.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Bernd Rücker from Camunda with a real masterclass on the decision of develop versus buying, and a very structured review of how we should approach that decision making, and what's available today to help us be successful, especially as we look at the pro code level that he discussed with us. Wonderful presentation, and we're going to build on that now at the top of the hour. When we come back, we're going to bring two global leaders that will discuss intelligent automation as a transformation agent. We're going to have Hema Gandhi, who is the CEO of Leighton Bridge, and joining her will be Rob Scott. He's the head of market service for Commerce Bank, and they're going to discuss global intelligent automation and how it's being done as a transformation agent for their organizations. So we'll be taking a break now. We'll see you all back at the top of the hour. Thank you.